Today's conversation is part of the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative, which my colleague Mohammad, Dr. Mohammad Gharipour, and I founded in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Our goal with this initiative is to explore how the outbreak of, response to, and lasting impact of epidemic illnesses help us understand urban environments and communities in the past, as well as in today's COVID era. One of the outcomes we hope to provoke with this Epidemic Urbanism Initiative is the fundamental rethinking of architectural scholarship, education, and practice in response to epidemic illnesses. Thinking about architectural education in particular, we recognize the need to bring new questions, topics, and lenses to seminars and studios alike in order to understand the complex relationship between cities and epidemic illness. Advocate the necessity of forging new global interdisciplinary collaborations in service of these questions, and seek novel, socially just interventions to better prevent and respond to urban epidemics. This in mind, we are pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ashraf Salama. Dr. Salama is Professor of Architecture and Director of Research and of the Cluster of Architecture and Urbanism in the Global South in the Department of Architecture at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, United Kingdom. He has led 3 schools of architecture in Egypt, Qatar, and the United Kingdom, 2 of which he has founded. His work and research have focused on curriculum development and design studio teaching practices, transformative and critical pedagogy, and sustainable architectural and urban design, with a strong emphasis on the impact of social cultural factors on shaping the built environment. Having authored and co-edited 14 books and published over 170 articles and chapters in the International Refereed Press, he's the chief editor of ArchNet International Journal of Architectural Research and co-chief editor of Open House International. Professor Salama is the recipient of the 2017 UIA Jean Chimy Prize for Excellence in Architectural Education and Criticism.
Thank you very much, Kate and Mohammad, for having me as part of your excellent endeavor on developing serious and focused discussions on epidemic urbanism and the associated implications and responses. Initially, I thought of expanding the discussion to include some elements of architectural education and design pedagogy pre-COVID-19 condition, but I felt this will go beyond the actual scope of your series, and thus the focus here is on implications and speculations during and post-COVID-19. I would like to start from a position that the consequences of the condition we are encountering now have been predicted in a way since the mid-90s. And this is through the work of many theorists. For example, through the work of William Mitchell and his trilogy of books that engage with the future. They include The City of Bits, Utopia, Me++, in which he introduces ideas related to the creation of digital communities and try to provide answers about how the transformation of digital communication, wireless technology, the creation of an interconnected world are changing our life and our environment. Likewise, the Castell's assumption in the 80s that the global city is not necessarily a place, but a process, seem to be valid in the context of a future post-pandemic condition. Although many people have questioned this assumption for many years about place versus process. So moving from the physical to the virtual doesn't seem to be new. But what is new here is the sudden shift that most organizations, communities, higher education institutions, including schools of architecture, have not been prepared for, and the level of urgency involved. What is new is that societies, communities, and individuals at a very personal level appear to be at odds, speculating the future and what the future will bring. And it appears to many that the future have arrived at our doorsteps without really recognizing that it is here now and we should react to it. perhaps arbitrarily, perhaps in a shock and awe manner, but surely at the expense of many things, including disease, panic, mental illness, restrictions on movement, travel, and public health. Of course, education is part of the formula and part of all of these. With respect to architecture education, there have been plenty of reports, guidance documents, short reviews, interviews, articles, and many, many discussions trying to speculate the future and respond and to see how architecture education is responding to the emergency situation generated by the pandemic. I believe this is a very good opportunity to reflect on some of these responses and to try to positively look at the challenges and opportunities ahead. Of course, we need to look at the positives and negatives and what the condition has brought with it. But in the scheme of things, we need to adopt a positive thinking. So in terms of during the COVID-19 reactions and responses, in a period of less than 3 weeks, so it's really 3 weeks, schools of architecture had to make significant decisions to desert face-to-face learning and physical spaces and move to a new world, a world in which online teaching and learning, collaboration, engagement, interaction, review and assessment, and also celebrating student achievements are the only safe form of group or collective activity. This is a significant moment in the history of many disciplines, but also in the history of architecture education. While many universities already have infrastructure for online teaching and learning activities, they needed to expand these in a very short period of time, upgrade them, switch to a maximum capacity. So basically, all schools of architecture globally are incredibly challenged, trying to do everything differently, which is a difficult task, I must say. And that everything, we say everything differently, that everything includes what used to characterize architecture education and design pedagogy since their inception, and the various models that were developed throughout the past 100, 150 years, whether Beaux-Arts, Bauhaus, Russian models, Swiss model, and all the versions of architecture education. So that situation that architecture education is facing now is not simply a response to the pandemic condition. It's not just a response, but what has evolved over 100 years is severely challenged. So this is the situation. It's not to fix a problem or to fix a temporary condition, but to address really a tradition that continued for 100 years and change it in a space of a few weeks or few months and make decisions about that. So schools are exploring possibilities to expand from a teaching delivery that aims to graduate students to meet professional needs, societal needs, to a teaching and learning process that generates graduates who can create opportunities for themselves. And this is really very difficult also when it comes to students. Basically making resources and mechanisms available to students with less teaching and less engagement. Because it's not a matter of moving from physical to digital or virtual, but it's also about the creation of opportunities. So this is very challenging, and I believe it will be rewarding where every single program, course, studio, module becomes an opportunity for reproduction and reinvention of what was evolved or has evolved for 100 years. The response during the early stages of the pandemic demonstrates that there were good practices and experiences which proved to be valid. And how can we say they are valid? They are valid in the sense of student work. So if we look at the student work that was exhibited in online shows and virtual shows, virtual exhibitions, it rises to the standard of what we have seen for many years in physical exhibitions. So that's an important evidence that the practices that were adopted were successful. I'm not trying to argue that online and virtual learning in architecture should replace the pre-COVID-19 condition. But based on my own experience and that of colleagues and many colleagues around the world, I argue that the emergency version of architecture education, and I would call it emergency version of architecture education, was to a great extent manageable. Yes, challenging, positive, but stressful, rewarding, but at times, of course, like anything new, frustrating and exhausting. So there were many mechanisms adopted by architecture schools, and I identify 5 here, which are not exclusive really. Some schools have developed mechanisms beyond those 5 that I'm going to mention. But those ones are the most common ones. Schools have continued to provide cultural and community facilities and activities through online fora, debates, webinars, even online recreational activities. Cooking classes and music sessions were adopted by some schools, and that's a positive sign. Keeping students occupied and focused through small group learning was also an important parameter in terms of these coping mechanisms. Utilizing technologies and available products, Google products, for example, like Hangouts and Google Jamboards and whiteboards, which are like scrapbooks, where every student, instructor, tutor can draw ideas and use sticky notes into these boards, and of course within an online engagement process. Some schools have adopted emergency measures, like providing every member of staff, teaching staff, additional IT facilities, softwares, equipments. Some went further and provided iPad and electronic pencils to every single person in the school. One of the important mechanisms pursued was enhancing assessment procedures and protocols. That's a very, very positive sign by making the assessment criteria clearer, developing standardized rubrics for evaluating student performance and design studio projects. These were very important. In parallel to that, there were positive messages communicated by professional organizations, school administrators, university leaderships, to spread positive messages with a focus on students' health and well-being. For example, aspects of long-term view of the profession. The focus that, yes, the profession is still waiting for us and we're going to flourish in the future was an important message to architecture students. Benefits of online learning in architecture, socialization, collaboration, engagement, collegiality, all these were important aspects that were emphasized and continue to be emphasized in these messages. It's a very important point also to mention that the picture was not really pretty all the time. While these are very important aspects and adaptation and mitigation procedures that schools have adopted, there have been severe challenges, and these were emphasized by heads of schools in many interviews and deans in various reports and online gatherings. Some of these challenges are about resources mostly. Getting access to software, for example, since much of it is available only on campus. That is one of the issues that was mentioned in the recent discussions. Most students continue to struggle with access to high-speed broadband, specialist computer for modeling and visualizations. Some also note that international students continue to struggle with Wi-Fi access as an additional difficulty to these difficulties. Online restrictions, software issues, or lack of resources. Some of these difficulties are not just limited to students also. One has to realize that architecture education relies on, in many ways and in many contexts, professional architects contributing to teaching on a fractional appointment basis. So this had also impacted them. In some contexts, such as the UK, Canadian universities, for example, the year-out placement, co-op programs and training as part of their education provisions was severely challenged. And they had to reshift their programs and their provisions to accommodate this. One would assume also that the case in many countries in the global south, in Africa, for example, in some African countries, in some Southeast Asian countries, South America, was even more challenging due to lack of resources or online infrastructure, availability of staff, and many other components that really represent challenges. And I want to refer here to a study in the context of the UK, but it's really very important to refer to it. It was a national design studio survey conducted in the context of the UK by Professor Alex Wright and Robert Grover in the Department of Architecture, Bath University. The study was based on an attitude survey and aimed at gathering views and perceptions on the impact of the COVID-19 condition on design pedagogy and architecture education. So that is very important. Nearly 800 students have responded to the survey, and a substantial number of teaching staff have also responded, and they come from 25 universities in the UK. The results try to juxtapose physical and virtual learning models as perceived by students and staff. And the outcome is really important. For example, we can see that overall satisfaction with learning fell by almost 60% following the move to remote teaching when compared to traditional teaching. Only 7% of the students and 4% of the faculty prefer remote learning or remote delivery to face-to-face teaching. That's an important outcome. Peer learning and peer support appear to be negatively impacted as expressed by the students. All aspects of studio culture and studio life were significantly negatively impacted. Students' sense of being part of a community was impacted. Motivational support is impacted. So these are very critical points that we need to look at when we try to conceive the future of architecture education. Majority of students highlighted the essential social nature of architecture education, facilitated by the physical environment of the studio, and they see it as very important to their learning. The impact on mental health, which is a result of isolation and working alone and all these aspects, a lack of peer support, were also emphasized by the students. What was also emphasized, which when we talk about global north, global south, we can also talk about even within a homogeneous group of students, there is disparity in terms of resources. And that was highlighted in the study. So these are very important results, but they are context-based and they cannot be really generalized to apply to architecture education globally, but they provide an excellent opportunity, an excellent platform to try to conceive the future of architecture education, or possibly replicating the study, redeveloping it, implementing it in other contexts where there is more empathy to the particularities of a specific school, its context, resources, and its people. So these are some of the challenges. So there were very, very positive elements, but also, I would say, significant challenges. There is no clear picture really about the future and the future of architecture education. There are some minor reports, there are some interviews, platforms like ArcDaily, Design, Archinet, Design Boom are all discussing these issues. So in trying to conceive the future of architecture education, I would refer to the notion or the idea of opportunities. So we need to look at opportunities with respect to the content itself, the content of architecture education. This is not to say that the process, learning styles, teaching styles are not that important. No, architecture education should continue to be looked at in terms of content, process, and teaching style. But these opportunities lie in the content and also in the process and teaching style, but I would focus here on the content. The post-pandemic architecture education should be seen really as an opportunity to re-examine some of the negative rituals of architecture education that continue to characterize architecture education. And we can talk about this in a different session, but there are negative tendencies within architecture education, disparities in terms of focus on specific areas at the expense of other areas. It is also an opportunity to re-examine contents, methods of delivery. It is an opportunity to engage with the global discourse on decolonization. Basically try to look at possibilities to decolonize the curriculum through expansion and by exploring and introducing diverse bodies of knowledge that are not necessarily based on the Western architectural authority or the established Western canons of design pedagogy. We can depart from that, and this is an opportunity for that. It is an opportunity to re-examine the idea of the hidden curriculum. So we have an explicit curriculum which focuses on the actual content of knowledge, but also there is a hidden curriculum that we never talk about, which refers to the appreciation of the unstated values, attitudes, norms that stem tacitly from the social relations of the learning setting. So now we are encountering a new learning setting. So what is the nature of the hidden curriculum here is important, which would require standards, protocols, and all these aspects to look at in the future of architecture education. It is also, the post-pandemic condition is also an opportunity to shift from large-scale building design projects to building adaptation, remodeling, retrofitting, and all these aspects. So the scale I would expect will be smaller to accommodate post-COVID emerging working and living styles and practices. I can see it also a very important opportunity for transdisciplinarity and transdisciplinary action to materialize. Why? Because issues from other disciplines, and here I mention environmental psychology, disaster psychology, public health, biophilia, and engagement with nature, can be integral to design practices. it is an opportunity to rethink the learning modes and learning from the built environment, the everyday urban environment, and to focus on people-environment relationships. That's really important, especially that there are talks now that these pandemics might become annual events. So they are coming to stay, basically, the pandemic and the practices associated and the measures related to them. So how are we going to live with that is really important in terms of architecture education. So if it becomes part of the collective psyche of architecture education, then we need to redefine the idea of learning from the environment, how the learning from the built environment can become an educational object with components and parts that can be subjected to or adapted to specific pedagogic orientation. It is an opportunity to bring research on pedagogy and practice, which is not a mainstream type of research, from its marginalized position within the academia to the forefront of discussions on knowledge production within architecture education, production, reproduction, and knowledge related practices. Since we don't know if this situation will ever return to normal pre-pandemic conditions, likely it will not. One would like to go beyond the notion of normal and new normal. So most of the discussion now are based on what was normal and what is a new normal, which represent another case. I refer here to an alternative notion, which is basically beyond the stable state. And it's a very important one that was introduced in the early 70s by Donald Schoen in his book, Beyond the Stable State, 1972, trying to see that as organizations and as higher education institutions, we live in a time of loss of the stable state. There is no stable state. A period in which stable views of occupations, religions, organizations, value systems have been eroded. And I would add here that the COVID-19 condition has generated further implications to the loss of the stable state. So the task of higher education institutions now, including heads of schools and deans, is to recognize that there will be no stable state coming, which some of us conceive as new normal. No, it's basically no stable state coming, which we still can live with and cope with and adapt to. And schools, in that perspective, should become learning systems that not only react positively to change. See, one problem of the new normal, it represents an atypical condition, which means, or some call it dynamic conservatism. And dynamic conservatism means fighting to stay the same. No, we don't want to fight to stay the same. We want to embed change, flexibility, adaptation as part of the teaching and learning process in architecture and urbanism. So we are facing really an interesting and challenging situation with changes that could eventually lead to changing at least an architecture education tradition that continued for centuries, to multiple traditions, multiple voices, multiple faces of architecture education that reshift the focus from objects and physical artifacts to people and communities. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.